We are rolling. Great. Well, again, welcome everyone to today's local government education program entitled Federal Legislative Updates for 2024. This is brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension and the National Association of Counties, or NACo. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development Educator based in Ogle County, up here in the northern state line region. I'd like to begin with some quick housekeeping notes familiar to everybody who's attended a Zoom webinar over the last 4 years or so. Please note that if you desire, you can activate Zoom's closed captioning. You can see that feature is available functioning at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording today's webinar and making it available on our Community and Economic Development YouTube channel. At the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email with slides and a link to the recording of the webinar. So if you aren't a registered participant, somebody shared this link with you, terrific, welcome. But please drop your email into the chat box. That way we will add you to the list and you'll receive the materials and recording, a link to the recording of the presentation. As always, you're welcome at any time to share your questions in the Zoom chat space. We'll review those questions in a Q&A session at the end of the main presentation. Now, we're happy to welcome to this long-running educational series our presenter for today, NACo's Associate Legislative Director for Agricultural and Rural Affairs, Owen Hart. Owen's responsibilities at NACo include a variety of topics, including advocating for county priorities in the agriculture and rural development policy spaces, analyzing legislative and regulatory activities and planning, and executing NACo's conferences and events. Owen holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Virginia and a BA in International Development Studies and Geography with a minor in Arabic from UCLA. So again, welcome to everyone, and thank you to Owen for being here. Owen, the microphone is yours.
Well, Mike, thank you so much, and hello, everyone. Great to be with you all today. Once again, my name is Owen Hart. I'm an Associate Legislative Director for Ag and Rural Affairs here at NACo. Thanks to Mike for the great introduction there. First up, before I get started, I just want to thank the Illinois Extension team for the opportunity to speak with you all today. Extension systems across the country are an incredible resource to counties and all of our residents, and particularly in rural areas. And I think too often that work really goes underappreciated. So the team here at the University of Illinois does a fantastic job, and I hope you all are seizing on the opportunity to work with them to get the chance. So I'm excited today to share an update on the federal policy landscape here in DC as far as relevant for rural governments, and then how NACo is looking to capitalize on some of these opportunities to support rural residents and communities across the country. So here's a quick list of the topics I'll be touching on in my update today. The topics I'm highlighting will have a rural lens, given that most of our audience today serves rural communities. But in case you're from a more suburban or urban community, I should still have a fair amount of useful information for you as well. I will be taking questions at the end, so if you have those in mind, please keep them, and I'd be happy to answer anything I can. So before I dive into the bulk of today's content, I'd like to give a quick introduction to NACo. If you're not familiar, NACo is the chief federal representative of America's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs. As the main representatives of county governments here in DC, we also represent, by extension, over 40,000 county elected officials and 3.6 million county employees all across the country. NACo is really driven in our work by a fundamental belief that when we strengthen our local communities and our counties, we strengthen the country. I think that's something we could probably all sympathize with. It's our job on the federal government affairs team at NACo to lift up the voices of counties and ensure that we have an equal seat at the table in the federal policy process. We don't believe counties are below the states or the federal government. We believe we're an equal partner in that relationship, and we want to make sure we're reflecting that in the policies we push for. We have just over 2,600 dues-paying members that actively participate in NACo programs and initiatives. That's 85% of the nation's counties. And this includes 90 of Illinois' 102 counties, many of which have officials serving in senior leadership positions at NACo. While NACo primarily interfaces with the federal government, we do work closely with other state and local representatives like the National League of Cities and the National Governors Association, as well as state associations for counties all across the country, including our colleagues here in Illinois, to advance and share priorities that can strengthen local governments. So I'm a member of NACo's government affairs team, but advocacy is just one aspect of what NACo does. We also have a significant research and support arm that carries out research on and for counties, promotes best practices, and then creates opportunities for our members to engage with state and federal partners as well as each other. We have hundreds of great resources available online, events all around the year that you can check out on our website at NACo.org, and I'd encourage you all to check out what we have on offer, because we have some pretty interesting things that you all might find useful. So diving in today, the first topic I'll touch on is perhaps the hottest topic in Capitol Hill today, the fiscal year 2024 appropriations process. This is particularly timely given that some key negotiations are ongoing today as we speak, and we're hoping that we'll see the end of this process that's been going on for months now within the next few weeks. So as a quick primer for those who may not be as familiar, the federal appropriations process refers to the system that Congress and the executive branch use to create and pass an annual federal budget. So every year, Congress drafts, considers, and passes 12 appropriations bills that provide funding for all federal agencies. These appropriations bills, as they're called for short, typically expire on September 30th of every year. That's the end of the federal fiscal year. And legislative slog to pass a new budget every year is one of the most high-profile issues that Congress deals with on a regular basis. Because spending bills are often sometimes the only major pieces of legislation that pass in a given year, or maybe one of a handful, they are often used as a vehicle to pass other legislative priorities, which adds an extra layer of challenge to this process. So Congress is still hard at work in negotiations over the fiscal year 2024 budget, despite the fact, of course, the fiscal year began in October of last year. So we're a little late in this process now. That being said, that's not completely out of the ordinary. As you can see on the left side of that slide there, Congress has actually only passed all 12 of the appropriations bills on time, as in before September 30th, 3 times in the last 47 years, most recently in 1997. So this is certainly not out of the ordinary for what we're seeing right now, although it is certainly frustrating to watch as we try to pass some shared priorities here. So the appropriations process really began back in June 2023. You all might remember the conflict over the federal debt ceiling. During that month, President Biden and then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy struck a deal to raise the federal debt limit ceiling in exchange for a cap on federal spending for the next 2 fiscal years. Resistance to the debt limit deal among conservative lawmakers particularly gridlocked the Republican-led House and ultimately cost Speaker McCarthy his job after McCarthy decided to work with Democrats to pass a short-term stopgap funding bill known as a continuing resolution in September, which extended the 2023 budget and then averted a government shutdown. McCarthy's now successor as Speaker, Mike Johnson of Louisiana, has so far been struggling to overcome this gridlock, although we are seeing some progress right now in negotiations. Since he took over in October, Johnson's been able to pass 2 more continuing resolutions since he assumed the speakership, one in November and then one in January. Notably, these stopgap spending bills make use of a, quote, laddered structure. You might have heard the term laddered CR in reporting around these issues. So what that essentially means is that of the 12 appropriations bills, he split some, 4 in this case, with an earlier deadline, and the other 8 with a later deadline. Currently, under the current continuing resolution, we have 4 of the 12 appropriations bills set to expire on Friday night, tomorrow, March 1st, while the other 8 are set to expire next Friday, March 8th. So if Congress fails to pass any of the 12 bills by their respective deadlines, we will likely see a partial government shutdown that we'll have to deal with here. So where are we now in budget negotiations? So it's been a long and winding road, as you saw on that last slide there, but it looks like we're nearing the end of negotiations of the 2024 appropriations. You might have seen a news headline yesterday when it was announced that congressional leaders had come to an agreement on a preliminary deal to advance budget negotiations. As the first part of this deal, they agreed on 6 of the 12 spending bills with top line numbers. Leaders hope to release text on those bills by this weekend and then clear the spending bills through Congress to send to the president's desk next week. Second, they agreed to introduce another continuing resolution to extend the deadlines for those 6 agreed upon bills to next Friday, so moving it back 1 week, and then March 22nd for the other 6 bills that are still being negotiated. Those 6 are a little more controversial, have a little more hangups in negotiation, and will need a little more time to finish those last couple hurdles. But it does feel like we're getting close. The House plans to pass this stopgap funding agreement at some point today, we're hoping, before taking off for the weekend, while the Senate's plan is to pass it first thing next week when they're back in town. So while this deal is certainly promising, there is a lot that can happen between now and when these deadlines come on Friday, so we'll be following this pretty closely over the next few days. So up next, the next item we'll discuss today is one of the other major pieces of legislation on the congressional agenda this year, the 2024 Farm Bill. And before I dive into the state of negotiations, I'll just give a brief rundown on the Farm Bill for folks who may not be as familiar. So the Farm Bill is the main federal legislative vehicle that sets not just federal farm policy, as the name implies, but also all policy relating to nutrition, energy, conservation, public lands management, rural development, among a host of other topics. It's one of the most significant bills that Congress considers on a regular basis. Programs authorized in the bill are also incredibly important to county governments, local governments generally, and all the residents that we serve. And not just rural counties either, but urban counties as well. Essentially, anyone who eats food in America is impacted by the Farm Bill in some way. So farm bills are typically authorized on a 5-year basis. The last Farm Bill was passed in 2018 and authorized $428 billion in funding over 5 years. You can see on the slide here a breakdown of the 2018 Farm Bill's 12 titles, which gives you an idea of truly how broad the Farm Bill's provisions are. The historical core of the Farm Bill are, of course, its farm programs. These include things such as federal crop insurance, and then programs provide technical assistance, access to capital for small and beginning farmers, as well as commodity subsidies that I'm sure many of you in Illinois are familiar with. These programs form the foundation of what we call the U.S. Farm Safety Net. Voluntary agriculture conservation programs, things like EQIP, are authorized in Title II of the Farm Bill. They are also an important piece of this network. I know that many of you are producers yourselves and are likely, again, very familiar with these programs. Title IV of the Farm Bill authorizes many of the country's most important nutrition programs, most notably the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. Other major titles include Title VI, which is the rural development title, which authorizes programs to help county governments provide essential services to their communities and fund critical infrastructure projects, such as local water systems, broadband, and community facilities. In my portfolio, I work on the rural affairs side. This is kind of our most important area of work within that title, and funds many of the programs that are administered by USDA Rural Development. So what you can see here is a breakdown of the last Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill's funding by title. This also shows you how much funding is authorized in the bill overall. So I mentioned before that the 2018 Farm Bill authorized $428 billion in funding when it was passed. But to assess the full long-term budgetary impact of the bill, we use an official estimate for 10 years from the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO. So according to the CBO's most recent baseline estimate, the total 10-year budgetary impact of the 2018 Farm Bill, if it was reauthorized again, as it is this year, would be a little over $1.5 trillion, which is the highest estimate in Farm Bill history. So stakes are pretty high for negotiations right now as Congress continues to work to reauthorize the Farm Bill. Now, the nutrition title, which again authorizes SNAP, makes up 84% of this spending, with farm subsidies, crop insurance, other farm programs make it up another roughly 15%. All other titles in the Farm Bill, including rural development, energy, and forestry, make up less than 1% of the bill's total budgetary impact. That being said, that 1% is still an incredible, a large amount of money when it comes to rural development programs, and it's really, really important that we make sure we're maintaining those funding numbers as well. One important note here as we consider the Farm Bill only authorizes program funding, and many of these funding totals don't reflect how much money is actually appropriated to these programs on an annual basis. Outside of certain mandatory programs like SNAP and crop insurance, most programs are discretionary and are subject to the appropriations process, and some may be authorized in the Farm Bill but never actually see any funding going to them. So something important to consider as we look at the Farm Bill here. So with that, let's take a look at where we are now in the Farm Bill reauthorization process. So to put it bluntly, we're still a long ways out from reauthorizing a new Farm Bill. The 2018 Farm Bill was originally set to expire on September 30th of last year, again, the end of the fiscal year. However, when it became evident that Congress would not be able to get a bill done before the end of the calendar year, as was originally planned, leadership was able to secure a year-long extension of the 2018 bill to the end of the 2024 fiscal year on September 30th. While we hope this will give lawmakers enough time to get a conference Farm Bill across the finish line before then, Congress will have to deal with a tricky series of obstacles to get to that point. So after more than a year of negotiations, neither the Senate nor the House Ag Committees, which have jurisdiction over this bill, have released any kind of language for review. This is mostly accounting to ongoing disagreements on some major policy sticking points, including a pretty wide gap in funding between the House and the Senate. There's also some competing legislative priorities that are blocking the bill from receiving the floor time it needs to move through Congress. appropriations being the best example of that. And the upcoming election cycle is also providing a block for the Farm Bill. A lot of legislators don't want to work on a Farm Bill during an election year. It's a politically sensitive topic, particularly for rural lawmakers, and folks would prefer to pass a Farm Bill before we get into the thick of things around May or so. So we essentially have the next 2 months to pass a Farm Bill if it's going to happen this year. So some of these sticking points include disagreements over money for agriculture conservation programs that receive funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, potential cuts to SNAP, and a push to move funding to in the bill to beef up commodity programs and crop insurance, as a lot of farmers have noted that a lot of the federal farm safety net is not adequate to meet their needs. It's also worth noting when we consider that farm bills are typically kept budget neutral after adjusting for inflation. So any changes in funding levels to individual programs authorized in the bill are usually accomplished by moving money from one program to another, which can add another level of complexity to negotiations. Leadership on the House and Senate Ag committees are likely looking to release a farm bill. Again, we're hoping in March or April of this year for debate, which they hope will allow the necessary time to hammer out negotiations again before the 2024 election. However, the sheer complexity of passing a bill of this size on a bipartisan basis in our current political environment will remain a pretty significant challenge. This means that the exact timeline in which we can expect a new farm bill to be signed is still up in the air. Somewhat disappointingly, we heard quotes this week from Senate Ag Committee Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow that she may actually block a farm bill this year rather than compromise with lawmakers on cuts to conservation funding and nutrition programs, which are seen as two kind of cornerstones of the Democratic support for the farm bill. Frankly, every day at this point that we go without releasing farm bill texts makes it less likely that we will see a farm bill in this calendar year. At this point, there's a good chance that Congress may choose to simply extend the farm bill again and attempt to pass it next Congress when it's a little more perhaps politically feasible. But we're certainly tracking this and hoping to partner with Congress to try to get a bill out this year if possible. So this slide here highlights a few of NACo's top priorities for the farm bill this year, so you can kind of get an idea of how in our capacity of supporting local governments and counties, we're looking at the programs the bill authorizes. So generally, we want to use the Farm Bill to streamline federal programs and make it easier for county governments and our residents to access federal funding and technical assistance. For a lot of rural communities, these programs are pretty arduous to apply for and to report. And when a lot of folks are struggling with capacity challenges, they might not have a grant writer on staff, they might not have access to funding to satisfy match requirements, they may not be able to take on a loan. It can be a significant challenge to access the resources that are really important that the Farm Bill authorizes. So we're always looking to streamline those kind of programs. We're also pushing for more robust support for the farm safety net programs, particularly programs to support new and underserved farmers that might need the most help. Many of our economies and tax bases in rural counties rely on these folks, and frankly, they're a really important part of the fabric of our communities. We want to make sure that we're getting all the support we can to those folks. We're also seeking to maintain funding for ag conservation programs that help counties to work with landowners to protect local ecosystems while keeping ag land in production. We see farmers as being on the front line of the conservation fight. We want to make sure that we're centering their interest and their ability in our approach to the local conservation. We also have a large number of priorities for the rural development programs authorized in Title VI of the bill, including continuing investment in rural broadband deployment, funding for infrastructure projects, and then hopefully we're trying to get a new grants-based program to support rural capacity building for county governments. This would allow counties to do things like hire on grant writers or build a permitting office. Some of the crunchy logistical things in the background that might cause a bottleneck that allows counties to not access funding normally. So if we can get folks the tools they need to access these resources, it would be a huge boon to unlock the other historic investments we've seen over the last few years and make sure they can really benefit rural communities. So the last item in particular would really help counties invest in personnel and technology here that could help access these federal resources. So finally, that last point, we're looking to use the bill to give the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, the two major federal land management agencies, the authority to work more closely with counties on land management projects, particularly in the realm of wildfire mitigation. As many of you know, wildfires don't start and stop according to the Forest Service unit boundaries. And we want to make sure that we're unlocking all the resources we can, all the opportunities to collaborate we can across the federal, state, and local levels to make sure we can treat entire landscapes and reduce fire risk for our communities. And the Farm Bill is one way we can do that by making it easier to form those partnerships. If you'd like to know more about our Farm Bill work, I encourage you all to check out NACo's Farm Bill resources at naco.org. You can scan the QR code on your screen with your phone if you'd like to access a primer we put together for our members on the Farm Bill. So if I can leave you with one thought while we're still on the Farm Bill as local officials, it's your stories and perspectives that we need to share with Congress to paint why this bill and the programs it authorizes are so important to our communities. So I encourage you all to reach out to your lawmakers in the House and the Senate and share kind of how the Farm Bill impacts your communities, because that story is really, really important. And many folks in DC don't always see that on a regular basis. So moving on, I'd like to discuss a few of the major developments we're seeing in the rural healthcare space and how NACo is advocating for our rural healthcare priorities. So when we think about rural healthcare here at NACo, there's a whole range of factors that make providing healthcare in rural areas distinct and often more challenging than it is in urban areas. Many of you may know that rural residents face lower life expectancies on average than urban residents, and one of the major reasons for this involves challenges in accessing affordable and reliable healthcare in rural communities. So a couple trends to highlight here that we're seeing. First, rural areas are losing capacity for maternal care, obstetrics, which impacts not only outcomes for mothers and infants, but also makes it harder to attract and retain young families in many rural communities. Rural areas often also lack access to specialized care and may not be able to reach adequate behavioral health resources, for example, for mental health treatments. This is something that I know many folks in the extension system deal with on a daily basis. Rural hospitals are also forced to close down or scale down their operations when faced with low caseloads and poor reimbursements. We'll get into that in a minute here. And this next one is obvious. Rural folks are, of course, at a disadvantage with healthcare access simply because of geography, right? Longer travel times, fewer and far between facilities, which just naturally has a negative impact on health outcomes for rural residents. Lastly, here on the bottom left, rural families often have a more difficult time accessing the right insurance options and are more likely to rely on Medicaid and CHIP for coverage, particularly for children. So these are some of the major trends that we're following here at NACo when it comes to rural health, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm sure many of you are struggling with issues in your own communities that are not reflected here, but these are just a few major trends that we're seeing nationwide. So with that, I'm now going to zoom in on two particular rural healthcare challenges related to rural hospitals and then rural emergency medical services, or EMS. So first, on rural hospitals. So it's no secret today that rural hospitals across the country are in real dire straits right now. Hospitals are facing some deep structural challenges to their economic models in recent years, and many are struggling to remain financially viable in our current environment. So over the last 13 years, we've seen 148 rural hospitals across the country eliminate inpatient care. 82 of these 148 hospitals have closed completely, which has been had a huge impact on rural communities across the country. On the right side of the slide, you can see a map of 6 rural hospitals in Illinois that have faced closures over the past 2 decades. Notably, 3 hospitals there in blue have closed completely in the last 2 years alone. So when a healthcare facility in a rural community closes, that can have a really devastating impact on a community. It's kind of obvious. So not only are residents losing out on a source of care they can access easily, but it's also a huge employer in many of these rural communities, which has a compounding factor on the impact of these closures. So the underlying reasons behind this trend are complex and varied, and often vary by geography. But we have seen a few nationwide trends emerge, including low payment rates from private insurance and Medicaid, compounded by increasing costs for Medicare. This leads to really low margins for many rural hospitals that make them really hard to survive economic shocks. We also have a critical shortage of trained healthcare professionals in rural areas, notably primary care physicians, are not readily available in rural communities when compared to urban communities. So while federal support provided during the COVID-19 pandemic helped staunch losses that many rural hospitals were experiencing, this support was ultimately temporary and hasn't fixed those structural challenges that hospitals are still dealing with. So at NACo, we've identified several key policy areas to focus on to address healthcare access in rural communities. These include advocating for additional resources for mental health and substance use treatment. The substance use crisis in many parts of the country has been a particularly devastating trend that we're seeing, and we want to make sure we're getting as many resources in the hands of local public health officials as we can. We also, as part of that, want to maintain the operation of critical access hospitals that might be some of the only ways that rural residents can access healthcare on a regular basis. We also want to explore alternative healthcare models that can make it easier for rural residents to access the care that they need. This includes approaches that can address some of the geographic challenges that residents face. These might be things like mobile healthcare clinics and telemedicine, as well as exploring maybe integrated care programs that combine some of these specialized care that folks need in rural areas, like maternity care, mental health, dental and vision, all of which can be accessed in a one-stop shop type of facility. We're also looking to collaborate with the private sector to improve healthcare delivery in rural areas as well. I'll also mention that the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, does have plenty of federal funding opportunities available that they've recently announced to support rural healthcare providers. I'd encourage you to look through all of those. However, most of these programs are discretionary and are subject to the appropriations process. So we'll have to wait until the fiscal year 2024 appropriations process concludes to see what kind of funding opportunities are available. That last point brings us to the second rural health topic I'll discuss today, which is rural emergency medical services, or EMS. So I'm sure many of you are aware, rural EMS providers are also having a difficult time finding the right models to remain economically viable in rural areas. As a result, many rural residents live in what we know as ambulance deserts. So an ambulance desert is an area that is more than 25 minutes away from the nearest ambulance service that can transport them to a healthcare facility. Across the country, 4.5 million people live in ambulance deserts. 2.3 million of them, which is a little over half, are in rural counties. So on the map on the right, you can see Illinois' ambulance deserts marked in yellow, mostly located around the western part of the state and the southern part of the state. Just to highlight how this impacts the state. So EMS providers struggle with a number of challenges in providing care in rural areas. First among them is how EMS services receive payment. So EMS providers are typically reimbursed for their services only when they provide transportation from a point of an accident or a healthcare incident to a healthcare facility. And this doesn't take into account any on-scene care that they might provide, what we call treatment in place or TIP, as well as any time on standby where they might be waiting for a call as well. This model works all right in urban and suburban areas where call volumes are high enough to guarantee enough payments to make that service viable. But in rural areas, populations are too low or too dispersed to make this model sustainable in most cases. The demographics and geography of many rural areas are also a major obstacle here. So rural populations are older on average than urban residents, necessitating more care. In turn, many EMS providers rely on volunteers for their staff. And as rural America ages, volunteers are harder to come by, as we really struggled to encourage volunteerism on a local level in many rural communities. And lastly, the sheer distances, again, the EMS services must travel to deliver care is another logistical obstacle that limits the capacity of providers and also increases their costs. These challenges are particularly impactful because when you live in a rural area, sometimes EMS is the only treatment you're guaranteed to have access to, which is something that we at NACo are trying to address. So there's a number of bills that NACo is tracking right now that could address some of these challenges at the federal level. One bill that we've supported is what's called the Siren Reauthorization Act, which would authorize an HHS grant program that provides funding of rural EMS and fire departments, or to rural EMS and fire departments, excuse me. This grant money is strictly for government and nonprofit entities, which makes it a great option for counties and municipalities searching for additional resources to support their local EMS providers. So that bill is actually sponsored by Illinois' very own Senator Dick Durbin, and we appreciate the senator's commitment to addressing this issue and championing it moving forward. This only scratches the surface of our health advocacy, and if anyone has more questions about health-related topics, I'd be happy to connect you with some of our in-house experts here at NACo. We also have plenty of resources available online for you to check out if you wish. So moving on to our next topic, we will discuss the current state of play on rural housing and workforce issues in rural areas. So the federal government funds several major programs that support counties' mission to support economic development and job creation in our communities. So many of these programs are authorized by a piece of legislation known as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. WIOA is the largest single source of federal funding for workforce development and activities, and helps counties tackle and overcome many of the challenges that are facing job seekers and employers in the communities that we serve. WIOA establishes this one-shop center delivery system, it's called, which provides convenient access to job search assistance, workforce training, career services to county residents all across the country. So counties are directly involved in 90% of the country's 550 local workforce development boards, which help administer some of these programs at the local level. And over $2.7 billion was advocated to state and local workforce development boards through WIOA in 2023. We're hoping to see similar funding levels or more here in 2024 as we work towards a reauthorization of WIOA for this in the 118th Congress. So specifically, WIOA dedicates 50% of the adult and dislocated worker funding towards upskilling workers through what's called individual training accounts and on-the-job learning, while redirecting an existing funding stream towards these kind of accounts for displaced workers. It also provides eligible displaced workers with accounts with a value of $5,000 to enroll in high-quality reskilling programs and reconnect with the workforce by repurposing existing resources at the Department of Labor. The bill also streamlines eligible training provider list, it's called, to focus on outcomes and ensure eligible programs are aligned with the skill and hiring demands of local employers. Finally, the program also provides greater flexibility to respond to local workforce needs by requiring 65% of youth funds statewide to be dedicated towards serving opportunity youth, while allowing states to work with their local boards to determine the appropriate percentage for each local area. So NACo is working with our partners in Congress to strongly support WIOA reauthorization this year. And specifically, again, we're pushing to increase funding under WIOA to support some of these workforce development programs because they are a huge asset to many of our members. So much like the rural healthcare topics we discussed earlier, rural housing has emerged as one of the top issues we're tracking at NACo, specifically affordable housing. So while housing issues impact communities of all sizes all over the country, in many rural communities, struggles with affordable housing in particular are particularly acute. So rural housing issues often are distinct in rural areas due to more limited private dollars available for development, less housing stock, as well as less capacity for rural local governments to address these issues on their own. This makes it comparatively more difficult for rural governments to adapt to things like population changes that might impact local housing stock. We saw that firsthand, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, as the rise of remote working opportunities led to a lot of folks in cities moving to small towns and driving up costs for residents. You can see that trend reflected on the map in the bottom right of the slide, particularly in the Mountain West, where many of these communities were just overrun with folks who wanting to move in and take advantage of the amenities that many of these small communities can provide. So across all of our housing advocacy here at NACo, county support first invest in additional federal resources to adequately support housing needs, modernizing and strengthening current federal programs, providing more direct funding opportunities to local governments, and then of course simplifying programs to reduce some of these burdensome regulations on local governments. So for rural housing in particular, we are tracking a number of legislative proposals that may address the affordable housing shortage in rural communities. One big one we're throwing our support behind right now is what's called the Rural Housing Service Reform Act. As many of you know, most rural-specific housing programs are run by USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which subsidizes loans and mortgages for rural residents. One of the biggest USDA housing programs is what's called the Section 515 loan program, which provides low-cost mortgages to rental unit owners, who must then provide the unit at an affordable rate for the duration of the mortgage. Most of these Section 515 mortgages were issued in the 70s and 80s, and a huge chunk of them are maturing right now, which could pull as much as 400,000 affordable housing units out of the rural housing supply in the next decade or so. So what this bill does would essentially decouple properties with Section 515 mortgages from other USDA housing programs, which makes it easier to keep these units enrolled in USDA's suite of affordable housing programs and keeping these units accessible for many of our workforce in rural areas. Notably, USDA housing programs are some of the only USDA programs that are not authorized through the Farm Bill. They're actually fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate Banking Committee. However, Senate Ag Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow has voiced support for attaching this bill to the Farm Bill as a policy rider on the Senate floor, a move which NACo supports. So we're hoping we'll see action on this, and really do believe this could be a transformational change for a lot of the affordable housing stock that's still around the country. So next, I'll discuss 3 different funding opportunities we're tracking that can support rural broadband and high-speed internet deployment access in rural communities. So first, we have the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP. So the ACP is a monthly benefit program created in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed a few years ago that allocates $14.2 billion to assist low-income households with their internet bills. Since it was launched in March 2022, ACP has had over 22 million households enrolled in this program, often with a lot of benefits. Again, we saw this firsthand at the county level for many of our residents, and are supportive of maintaining these programs moving forward. However, the tranche of funding that was provided in the infrastructure law is set to expire in April of this year, after which the program will shut down and the folks who have been using the ACP subsidies will be de-enrolled. FCC, which administers the program, is currently in the process of winding down, and they're no longer accepting new applications to this program. So we are kind of in the closing stages in its current form. That being said, NACo is currently supporting the Affordable Connectivity Program Extension Act. This is a bill in Congress which has been introduced on a bipartisan basis to provide an additional $7 billion in funding to ACP, which would allow the program to continue providing benefits through the end of 2024. So we're hoping to see action on that here soon, and definitely a space to watch if you have residents who use this program. Up next, we have what's probably the most significant investment in broadband at the federal level right now, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, also known as BEAD. So like ACP, the BEAD program was created in the bipartisan infrastructure law and was allocated $42.45 billion in funding to promote high-speed broadband service to unserved and underserved areas of the country. So this program will have an outsized impact once it gets implemented in rural communities that often struggle to access high-speed internet compared to residents of urban and suburban communities that don't have those same struggles. Illinois was specifically one of the biggest beneficiaries of BEAD. The state broadband office received $1.04 billion in funding through the program, which will be support broadband deployment projects that need to be constructed by the end of the decade. So there is a nice time frame on this that makes these investments particularly timely. The top item in the BEAD process to highlight right now is that we are now in what's called the state challenge process phase of this program. So state broadband offices, which receive the funding from NTIA at the federal level, are currently undergoing state-level review of broadband availability across the state to determine which locations will be deemed grant eligible under BEAD. And local governments are one of the three types of organizations that can contribute to this process, along with internet service providers and nonprofits. So the Illinois State Challenge process opened up on Wednesday of this week, so this is particularly timely. And I'd encourage all of you to take a look at the state's broadband map online, again, which you can find through the state broadband office. And if you believe some of the parcel level information is inaccurate with the speeds it's supporting, please reach out to the state broadband office to take part in the challenge process. That's the only way that we can ensure that projects that truly qualify for this program can benefit from this funding. We've asked our members personally to mobilize and engage with their state broadband offices to effectively advocate for their unserved and underserved locations in your communities. And we'll make sure to keep following this as the program continues to roll out. So for our last broadband item today, I'll touch on USDA's Rural E-Connectivity or Reconnect program. The Reconnect program is administered by USDA's Rural Utility Service and provides funding for rural-specific broadband development projects. It's one of the only rural-specific programs that are out there for broadband funding at the federal level. Reconnect offers both loan and grant funds to qualified applicants, covering the cost of construction, improvement, or acquisition of facilities and equipment for broadband service. So the program was first created in 2018, and since then, it's received substantial additional funding from Congress based on the results that we've seen from its deployment. And that funding totals in the billions of dollars and has already made significant strides in expanding broadband access in rural areas. So last week, the Rural Utility Service has announced that it's opening the 5th round of Reconnect program funding. And this latest round, $200 million is available for loans, $150 million is available for grants, and $100 million is available for combined loan and grant support. So it's a very flexible program that can meet a lot of different communities' needs through its offerings. I should also mention that local governments are directly eligible to access this funding as project sponsors. So RUS will be accepting applications for this round of funding beginning on March 22nd, and we'll close the application window on May 21st. We just heard yesterday, actually, that initial window was moved back to May 21st. So we'll have additional time to apply if this is of interest to you. For those interested in learning more, RUS will be hosting a webinar on March 6th, which will provide detailed information about the Reconnect program and the application process if you're curious in learning more. Ultimately, RUS has set a goal to make awards by the end of September 2024, which is a pretty tight timeline, with funded activities to be completed within 5 years. To be eligible for the program, applicants must ensure that at least 90% of the households in the proposed funding service area, which is the area that will be served by a project, lack sufficient broadband access. Again, sufficient broadband access, which is kind of a tricky term, but USDA has defined that as meaning less than 25 upload speeds and 25 download speeds and 3 megabytes per second upload speeds in broadband service. So NACo has been highly supportive of Reconnect since it was first created in 2018. We're hoping to improve and increase funding for the program through the Farm Bill this year. Again, the bill was not, or Reconnect was not created in the Farm Bill, but there's a lot of interest in rolling Reconnect into the Farm Bill's baseline, which will make it a somewhat permanent program that can receive more regular infusions of federal funding. Again, we're hoping to do that by incorporating it into the Farm Bill's rule development title with some of the existing broadband programs that are in the Farm Bill. So on the environment and energy front, NACo is also closely tracking efforts to reform the federal permitting and environmental review process. So NACo has been highly engaged with our federal partners on efforts to reform that process. Much of this discussion centers around what's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is a landmark federal law that requires federally funded infrastructure projects to undergo environmental review before receiving federal permitting. So NEPA and other federal permitting regulations often slow down projects that our communities really need. I'm sure all of you can think of examples in your own communities where you've been negatively impacted by permitting challenges. And this is a huge problem at the county level. Annually, counties invest over $130 billion in public works, which is a huge infusion into our local economies for projects that our residents rely upon. And streamlining the federal permitting process will allow for more efficient and timely development for projects, again, that our residents really, really rely upon. We support common sense measures to streamline NEPA and the federal permitting process for infrastructure projects, as long, and this is key here, that we maintain local authority on land use decisions. We don't want to see local governments get cut out of this process in the efforts to reform. So as permitting has become a hot topic on Capitol Hill over the past year or two, NACo has been involved in the ongoing discussions around some pretty major legislative proposals to reform federal permitting. While we certainly support some of these efforts, often these proposals put a target on the backs of local governments by attempting to, again, to cut locals out of the permitting process. We see this as an attempt to disenfranchise local communities that are directly impacted by these projects. And moving forward, we want to make sure that we're trying to find ways to make it easier to build, but that we're also protecting local authority and centering community voices in that permitting process. So while we continue to work to move a permitting reform package we'd support through Congress this year, it is worth noting that the current political environment makes permitting reform legislation unlikely in the 118th Congress, and something that we'll probably see lawmakers circle back to after the election wraps up in the winter or spring of next year. So we're currently right now trying to position ourselves with a set of packages that we can bring to lawmakers that would feature some proposals that we'd be supportive of. Another issue we're tracking, and this is kind of an emerging topic among our membership that I know many folks in Illinois are feeling personally, is the ongoing pressure to balance priorities related to housing needs, energy development, and of course, preserving agricultural land. As we've seen increased levels of urbanization across the country, we're seeing a pretty rapid loss of farmland all over the place. According to USDA, the US loses an average of 1.8 million acres of agricultural land every year. And that's an area twice the size of Rhode Island every single year. Agriculture is incredibly important, again, to county governments all over the country, and particularly in Illinois. Moving forward, we want to make sure we're helping counties to strike the right balance between these conflicting land use pressures while ensuring that the most valuable working lands can remain in production. In the call-out box in the bottom right of this slide, you can see some language that we just passed at our legislative conference that sets NACo policy on this area. Again, we want to make sure that we're finding ways to allow communities to explore some of these different land use options, like building more housing or developing clean energy. But we also want to make sure that we're protecting our agricultural lands as well as local decision-making authority regarding land use. So something we're still tracking right now. Folks in the Hill are still working on some proposals around this that we're involved with. USDA is also working on some guidance that can ensure that siting practices, particularly for solar projects, can be located on more marginal ag land if they are going to be developed there, and are hoping to have more to share on that in the coming year. So we're right at the heart of that conversation with USDA. So for our final topic of the day, I know we're running a little low on time here. I'll just quickly touch on a topic that is really important to county governments this year, which is election security. So as you may know, in most states, counties directly administer federal elections within our jurisdictions. This is one of the most important civic responsibilities that counties have, and NACo has made it a core part of our mission to support counties in administering safe and secure elections. The federal government funds election administration through what's called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. HAVA directs funding directly to state governments to support election administration. However, the states can allocate HAVA funding as they see fit. So this means that counties don't always receive the support they need through this program. That places an additional burden on our county election officials, and it's something that we're trying to address in the year to come. Election funding through HAVA is also discretionary. It's worth flagging. HAVA grants are funded through the Financial Services and General Government, or FSGG, appropriations bill. So this is something we're tracking very closely right now as we're still in the appropriations process. So we're trying to monitor right now how much funding for elections we can expect for fiscal year 2024 as we move into the election. From the text we've seen so far, as we've seen preliminary text from the House and Senate, the House version of the FSGG bill would completely eliminate elections funding, while the Senate version would provide $75 million for HAVA grants, which of course is not as much as we would hope for, but we do appreciate the Senate's commitment to supporting election integrity this year. With an important election cycle coming up in just a few months, NACo will of course continue to work with our congressional partners to ensure that we have the adequate funding on hand to support election security through the final fiscal year 2024 budget. So definitely a space to watch. So NACo has supported a whole host of bipartisan legislation that aims to help counties improve election security. You can see some of them on the screen here. In the interest of time, I won't dive into these bills, but please feel free to scan the QR codes on the screen to learn more about each of them. Again, these are huge priorities for NACo and really important to the operation of just basic democracy at the local level. So I encourage you all to check those out. So I think I'll wrap up there so we can have plenty of time for questions. I've left my contact info here if you'd like to connect with me on any of the items we've covered today. And I'm also happy to put you in touch with any of our colleagues who work on other issues in case you'd like to learn more about those. Again, I work on our Ag and Rural Affairs portfolio, but of course, happy to connect you with anybody if there's any items today you'd like to discuss in more detail. You can also scan that QR code on the right side of the screen to access NACo's website, check out more of our resources. I'm sure we'd find something there that will be valuable to you in whatever challenges your community is facing at the local level. So with that, I'll wrap up there and turn it back to Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Owen. That's a lot of information. Of course, there's a lot going on, and we greatly appreciate your overview of it. The floor is open for questions. We don't see anything in the chat, but feel free to drop something into the chat, or if you'd like to open up your microphone and perhaps pose a question to Owen, feel free. Owen, perhaps I'll throw in something. You spoke about a great, a broad number of topics. If you, oh, here we go. Well, tell you what, before we go to the question I was going to pose, let's pick up William Donahue's question. What can counties do for the Farm Bill success? What can they help, can they help support that process?
Yeah, thank you, sir. That's a great question. So I'm our lead Farm Bill guy. This has kind of become my Super Bowl right now as we push a Farm Bill this year. What I tell our members about the county role in Farm Bill negotiations is this. So the Farm Bill every 5 years hinges on finding a balance between the farm programs that the bill authorizes and the nutrition programs, or the food programs. A lot of people ask, why is the Farm Bill authorize all this money for nutrition programs? It seems like a separate issue. And that was initially done back in the 70s when SNAP was first created, in order to make sure that you can bring together the cohorts that support nutrition and food and farms into one bill. It's often passes on a widely bipartisan basis because of that. That being said, recently it's been harder and harder to strike that balance. Where counties can come into that debate is that counties have equities on both sides, in both categories there of programs. And what we can do is we can come tell the local story about how we're impacted by both nutrition and farm programs, how we see them as two sides of the same coin, to help our partners at the federal level really strike that balance. It's really important to find ways where we can tie together those two narratives into how they can support all of our residents. Again, all of our residents are also their constituents. And so what we're doing every day is try to find ways to where Congress can really thread that needle and strike that balance and see how both sides can benefit each other.
Good. Again, thanks for that question. There's a comment about an interest in discussing how solar panels can be approved and implemented without neighbors knowing until too late. And I think that's probably more directed toward local county level regulatory and the legislative provisions that really it doesn't fall too much under the purview of federal legislation, unless there's something out there, Owen, that you might be aware of that I'm not.
Hi, this is Vicki Shalaphone. I was the one that posed that information for consideration of discussion. So Illinois does have a state law that really limits what counties can do.
Mhm.
But just in my own neighborhood, recently we understand there will be a new 2,400 acre solar farm, and there was no notification to anybody that to the best of my knowledge about it. So, there's a lot of hearsay about what happens to your property, but I did not move to where I live now to have the view of a solar panel farm in my front yard. So just putting that out there. So is there any federal regulations that would oversee the state regulation that pretty much has none?
Right. Thank you, Vicki, for the question there, and totally understand your sentiment. But I got members from all over the country that are dealing with the same issues that you are in your community there. So to answer your question, it's hard to say. Every state is different. The regulations they have in the books, so that environment is different based on where you're looking at. I think there's widely perceived to be the lack of the right regulation in place at the federal level that can provide avenues for community buy-in to these kind of projects. Ultimately, whether solar development is placed on a parcel of land or not is primarily at the landowner's discretion. And so we want to make sure at the county level that we're not treading on what folks can do with their own land there too much. That being said, we're working at the federal level with some of these permitting packages that I mentioned before to make sure that we're encouraging things like community benefit agreements, for example, or CBAs that allow for perhaps a fast track permitting process. If a developer, a landowner in the local community, this could be the county, this could be community organizations, any number of different stakeholder groups can get together in the pre-planning process to make sure we can hammer out a way that this project can kind of satisfy all parties and come to a compromise. Obviously, it's a tricky problem. There's a lack of federal guidance overall with this. We've seen a lot more interest in clean energy development with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which put a bunch of money to incentivize these programs. And we're still working through some of these challenges like what you're seeing in your community. But we're hopeful that we can harness some of the interest in acting on some of these on some of these challenges that folks are seeing, both with agencies, with Department of Energy and Agriculture, and with Congress, to try to find ways where we can make sure that communities have more of a say in how these projects are developed. Because ultimately it saves everyone time and money from litigation or any of these kind of problems in the long run if we can come to a way that these projects can benefit everybody. So I wish I had a better answer for you, Vicki, at the Illinois level, but just know that we are working at this at the federal level here.
Okay, well, I appreciate the input. Thank you.
Of course.
Oh, and thanks for that information. We've got another question, and this is on a topic that is also of interest statewide. With your focus on rural deserts of various types, I'm curious if you or NACo tracks childcare deserts as well, and if that's part of the Farm Bill.
Definitely, Caroline, that's a fantastic question. The answer is yes, we are tracking that pretty closely. Childcare is a huge barrier for a lot of rural communities in their capacities to attract younger folks, to maintain younger residents in their communities and retain them. And particularly for farmers, it's a huge problem with maintaining a farm work or farm labor force and keeping young folks in the industry. So it's something that's attracted a lot of interest from both sides of the aisle. I think it's widely perceived as a huge problem. And it's something that NACo is very active in as well. There's one marker bill that we're following right now called I think it's Expanding Childcare in Rural America Act. That's a bipartisan piece of legislation that would provide funding to support things like new childcare centers in rural areas or to train or pay for childcare professionals that can help kind of answer some of these gaps. Obviously, this isn't like a one size fits all approach to this. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to build out the kind of economies of care in rural communities, but it is something that's attracting a lot of attention on the Hill, and NACo is at the heart of that conversation. Thanks for the question.
very reassuring. And that's something that certainly in our communities is always a topic for conversation. I'm going to take a moment now and put up a quick poll. There it is. If you take a moment to answer it, just a quick evaluation of how this has contributed to your awareness of these issues. And I think we might have time for one more question if anybody would like to put it up. It's been a busy day. It's been a busy week, and there's always plenty in the news about things going on in the world of legislation, whether it's on the federal level or the state level. Owen, if you had to highlight a single piece, clearly the Farm Bill is something that you spend plenty of time thinking about. What else? What's the one preeminent issue that you'd ask people to pay attention to over the coming 6 months?
Sure, that's a great question, Mike. I'm going to kind of come at this from the county perspective here. Obviously, depending on what kind of stakeholder you are, your perspective here might differ. But as someone who operates in the rural development space as a local representative, something that we're really excited about is the potential for a new program around what's called rural capacity building. Obviously, I kind of mentioned this before. Rural communities have a really hard time accessing, competing, and maintaining federal funding opportunities, right? Most rural development programs are loans, not grants. There's a ton of money out there to begin with, and the programs that are out there are incredibly complicated to navigate, particularly if you're not a trained grant writer or don't have a lot of experience with these federal programs. I mean, heck, a lot of our commissioners, right, they're part-time. They might have a spouse coming in on the weekends to help them do grant writing. And that's all in addition to their other roles in the community as well, as business owner, neighbor, what have you. And so a lot of our rural folks don't have the capacity to access these funding opportunities. Oftentimes they're competing with, Cook County might be competing with Peoria County or something like that, right? In Illinois for the same pot of funding. And frankly, that's unfair to a lot of rural communities. So a bill that we're working on that we're really excited to support is what's called the Rural Partnerships and Prosperity Act of 2023. It's a bipartisan bill currently just in the Senate, sponsored by Bob Casey from Pennsylvania and Deb Fisher from Nebraska, that would essentially create a grant program for rural communities that will fund some of these more logistical, bottlenecks that create challenges in rural communities. It's really flexible money. You can, of course, use it to hire a grant writer, to use it for matching, for additional federal programs, use it to attract, philanthropy dollars, what have you. But you can also use it for things like, building a new childcare facility in your community, or helping deal with water challenges that you may have. Just for example, it also provides money for technical assistance providers. So if you have a nonprofit in your community, things like the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, they can come in, receive money through this program, and help you access these federal funding opportunities as well. It's kind of a way to almost outsource those issues for you. We're still kind of working out funding numbers for that. It's still not certain it's going to make it into the bill. It sounds like it is in the Senate at least, but we're still working on the House side. But this is something that folks in the rural development space have been working on for decades at this point, and it's the closest that we've had to building some kind of program that can really address some of the challenges that a lot of our rural communities face. It's something that I've found to be particularly rewarding to work on, and I really hope it makes it into the bill this year.
Well, that was a great theme to end on. That's capacity building is something that is certainly lies at the heart of so much of what so many folks on this call do. And we're grateful that you chose that as a high point. Listen, we are at our 1 o'clock hour, let's see if we've got any more questions here. A couple have popped in. Somebody asked, what is that called again? I think referring to the piece of legislation that you just mentioned.
That bill, that's called and I can put the congress.gov link in the chat here afterwards, but it's called the Rural Partnerships and Prosperity Act of 2023. Let me pull that up real quick. Really encourage you to check it out. Encourage you to reach out to your lawmakers if it's something that's of interest to you. It's a pretty fantastic bill, and we're really excited that we were able to get it introduced this year. So check that out. Highly encourage you to do that. It's, again, one of our top priorities this year.
Well, that's terrific. And let's close out. I'd on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, I really want to thank you, Owen, for your presentation today. Insightful and extensive, and greatly appreciated by everybody who was in the room, I'm sure. As I mentioned earlier to the folks still in the room, if you are registered for the webinar, you'll receive the presentation materials and a link to the recording in a follow-up email. If you are not already receiving our email notices, or if you joined this presentation, as I mentioned earlier, by someone sharing a link, please drop your email into the chat before you go. We saw that a bunch of folks did at the start of the session. We'll add you to the email list for this and for the materials, as well as for upcoming presentations. For example, coming up on March 5th, I want to put in a plug for a presentation again at high noon. Please join us for a presentation with Rural Partners on Illinois Area Healthcare Centers, or AHECs. This is part of a series 2 days later on Thursday, March 7th. Hop onto your computer at noon for our webinar on maternity care deserts in Illinois and SIU's work on maternal fetal medicine. Also want to invite you to visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE to access our video archives on prior presentations on a wide variety of community development topics. Thank you again all for attending today's webinar. We appreciate it as always. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thanks so much.